Good afternoon. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I would like to thank you for joining us. Today, we are very pleased to welcome veteran journalist Stephen Solomon to our program. Mr. Solomon has written for the New York Times, Business Week, The Economist, Forbes, and Esquire. Additionally, he has appeared on CNBC, NPR's Talk of the Nation, Bloomberg TV, and other news shows. His earlier book, Confidence Game, presciently warned about the increasing dangers in the volatile global financial system. This afternoon, Mr. Solomon will be discussing his latest work, Water, the Epic Struggle for Wealth, Power, and Civilization. This book will be available for you to purchase at the end of the hour today. Water has always been a precious commodity, but for those who find it in short supply, its value is becoming even more apparent day by day. In fact, I know many of you may have been reading or hearing about how water is the new oil. While it's true that water, like oil, is critical to the global economy, however, unlike oil, there is no substitute. Water has been and is the most important driver of human development. In Water, the Epic Struggle for Wealth, Power, and Civilization, Mr. Solomon writes about the role of water in world history. He tells us that water has always been of great importance and has simply returned to the primacy it held from the earliest of times. He explains how water, once made manageable, navigable, and potable, became pivotal to the rise and fall of great civilizations and their achievements. He gives examples from Mesopotamia, the Roman Empire, medieval China, and Islam's Golden Age, to Europe's rise, the steam-powered Industrial Revolution, and to America, to show how water has always played an essential role in advancing human aspirations and the prosperity of nations. Today, supplies of water, at least the clean, easily accessible sort, are coming under enormous strain. Freshwater scarcity, due to the needs of a growing global population, climate change, and mismanagement, particularly in poor countries where industrialization is contaminating rivers and aquifers, has become one of the 21st century's looming challenges. With the demands of a world population soaring towards 9 billion by 2050 and only 2.5% of water on Earth being fresh, the challenges are enormous. As several reports have indicated, water consumption needs are doubling every 20 years. If we stay on our current course, we will outstrip nature's sustainable supply of accessible fresh water. As the quest for water drives new political, economic, and environmental realities across the globe, it is very likely that water famine could outstrip food famine, even causing future wars. We have already seen how genocide, disease, and civil warfare have increased as water-starved, overpopulated areas of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East fight for this precious resource. While the scenario of an impending global water crisis is pretty bleak, you may ask how the issues came to be and whether there is a solution. Although there is no one-size-fits-all, there are several things that can be done. To find out just what can be accomplished, please join me in welcoming our guest today, Stephen Solomon. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Joanne, and thank you for the excellent introduction that I can get throughout half my speech. Actually, thank you for all of you for coming and taking time from your busy schedule to contemplate that precious, clear liquid that many of us carry around with us every day in a little personal bottles, and what we would do if we didn't have it. The topic I'm going to discuss is the greatest crisis that most Americans are only beginning to hear about, and that is global freshwater scarcity. And in fact, I do argue in this book that water is overtaking oil as human society's scarcest critical resource. And if you want to think of an analogy, just as oil transformed the history of the 20th century, I think freshwater is already beginning to shape the geopolitics, the economics, environment, domestic politics, and the quality of our everyday life in the 21st century. And it's even more important because it is so indispensable. You can't drink oil and you can't grow food with it. What is happening essentially is that under the duress of rising population and the voracious demand of our industrial society that been using water at twice the rate of population growth, and also a lot of our own inefficient water practices, more and more nations around the world are outstripping their available, sustainable supply of fresh water. And by that I mean the finite amount of water that continually self-renews through the natural process of evaporation and precipitation to replenish the rivers and the lakes and the shallow groundwaters that have been the source of water for all human history. Our ecosystems are getting depleted, and we're starting to run dry for many key economic uses and for human uses in agriculture, industry, and energy production. Given our current practices and technologies, more and more parts of the world, there's simply not enough available to replenish the water ecosystems for the world's 6.5 billion today, much less the 9 billion we're becoming. And many of those would wish to be meat eaters as well in middle-class diets, which even uses more water than the absolute increase in population growth. As a result, global society is polarizing into what you might think of as water haves and have-not societies. We always try to look back to our founding fathers in times of stress for wisdom. I think Ben Franklin has puts it pretty nicely. He says, "When the well is empty, we learn the worth of water." Well, the global well is starting to go dry, and we're all starting to learn the worth of water. I'd like to start, actually, our exploration in the front lines of one place on the world water crisis front lines. That would be Pakistan, where Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a rather tumultuous visit in last October, 2009. And behind all the headlines that generated, she was repeatedly beseeched by Pakistani leaders about Pakistan's impending water and food crisis. And of course, she paid close attention to that, not just because of Pakistan being a critical ally in the Afghan war and the war on terrorism, but Pakistan itself is a nuclear-armed, Taliban-besieged, politically fractious state that would be really our ultimate failed state nightmare, I think, if that state should fall apart. And water is one of the pressure points on that state. To meet the necessities of its growing population, which actually quintupled since independence in 1947, and is expected to grow another 30% to 225 million within about 15 years, Pakistan is in desperate need of revitalizing its very badly decaying irrigation and drainage system. It has the largest contiguous irrigation system in the world, about 10 times the size of Massachusetts. It's also running short on hydropower, and the storage capacity of its lifeline river, the Indus, has only 30 days storage against, let's say, an unforeseen drought. It's rather terrifying. We have, in the United States or Australia, has about 30 times more storage against that kind of an event. Aswan Dam when it's full, can hold 2 years. It has relied heavily on groundwater, pumping groundwater for its agriculture. It's been over-pumping the groundwater beyond its replenishable rates by nature, and its groundwater tables are now falling to levels that are hitting quality and quantity limits. At the same time, its surface irrigation on the Indus is also badly overtapped and causing many of the problems of salination as well. The Indus itself is, like many other rivers around the world, 70 or so of the major rivers, is so badly overdrawn that it no longer reaches the deltas. I mean, the deltas are and this is true in the Colorado, it's true in the Rio Grande, it's true on the Nile or the Yellow and the rivers as well, no longer really reach their deltas to replenish them. And those have been fertile areas both for food and for biodiversity throughout history. But now there's a special problem that is on top of this one, and that is this, that 50% of the water from the Indus River comes from glaciers up in the Himalayas, and these Himalayan glaciers have been melting at an extraordinarily fast rate. And the predictions now are that it is going to lose one third of its flow in the next 15 to 20 years, at the same time that its population is going to be growing, and it has all these other very serious, formidable problems to deal with. On top of that, the shortages that it currently faces, much less have already set off internal schisms between the Sindhis in the south, who feel that the Punjabis in the north are taking too much of the water. And it gets pretty complicated because next door, of course, is India. And India is where the Indus actually passes through before it arrives in Pakistan. They fought 3 wars between over the years, and there's ongoing disputes in the Kashmir, as we know. They believe, somewhat paranoiacally, but who knows, that India has designs to withhold water. I use it as a part of this diplomatic pressure points against them to prevent it from entering Pakistan if and when the situation arises. There was a recent summit, a very recent summit, that the United States, in fact, helped to facilitate between the 2 prime ministers, ostensibly to get past the problem of the bombing in Mumbai by the terrorists who had originated in Pakistan. And a fair portion of that meeting was spent, from Pakistan's standpoint, accusing India of violating the 1960 Indus River Treaty by building some hydropower dams on some of the tributaries that lead into to the Indus and feed the Indus. This Indus River Treaty is considered to be, by many, one of the great achievements of holding off water wars in this region of the world, but almost everybody now believes it is in drastic need of a renewal. Pakistan is also highly suspicious of India's aid for damming in Afghanistan. Afghanistan provides 20% of the water from to the Indus River, and when the Americans leave eventually, I think they don't want to find themselves surrounded by India and its allies able to control the water valves. Now, India, of course, has its own very severe water and food and energy shortage crises, and in fact, in many ways, worse than Pakistan's, that it is trying to mitigate. It has been drilling, it has drilled something like 22 million tube wells over the last, since 1975, to feed its population growth. And many of these wells are now going dry. And on top of that, they still also suffer from the erratic swings of the monsoons for rain-fed agriculture, which are getting worse with climate change. It's not only very possible, it is almost a sure thing that India will no longer be one of those countries that no longer will be able to feed itself in the next number of years and will become a major grain importer. This is going to change the dynamics of world food trade markets for everybody in the world and be a major source of concern. Of course, the United States has been alarmed and concerned about Pakistan for some time and its stability, and was very much alarmed in April of '09. And some of you may have noticed the Taliban broke out of the northwest provinces and entered into Bunair, and put it within 25 miles of this giant Tarbella Dam on the Indus. It's sort of like the Hoover Dam, if you thought of losing the Hoover, or the Aswan Dam, for example, in Egypt. Any damage to that dam would cripple Pakistan's hydropower, agriculture, and obviously any control over it would give enormous strategic leverage to the Taliban. Now, Hillary Clinton and the State Department, of course, did respond to Pakistan's concerns. We have just recently passed a $7.5 billion 5-year aid package. The largest and most urgent part of that, I wish all of you to be aware, was addressed to those water issues of irrigation, hydropower, and storage. And they've also, of course, been trying to facilitate as much as possible the India-Pakistan dialogue on water security. Now, whether this is going to leverage other greater capital investments that the Pakistanis have, of course, but whether this is going to be enough for Pakistan, a country where 60% of the people make a living as farmers, to get by the destabilizing pressures from this food crisis is anybody's guess. But there's one bit of encouraging news in this, and maybe it seems obvious to people, but for the first time, global water scarcity is being recognized as a vital objective of U.S. national security interests and is being integrated into the highest level processes at the State Department. Just on March 22nd, World Water Day, Hillary Clinton gave a speech that signaled, in fact, this. I've been speaking to the State Department before that, and the process has been ongoing for some time. But they do, in fact, get it, which is a very important point, that that freshwater scarcity is emerging as one of the key driving fulcrums of the world geopolitics and creating a whole new calculus of strategic challenges for policymakers. One of those, of course, is related to climate change. Now, when you think of water, you should think of climate change at the same time, because climate change is really the water crisis in hyperdrive. I mean, the climate change wreaks most of its damage by exacerbating things like, creating things like unpredictable and extreme floods, droughts, melting glaciers. And what do? They overwhelm water infrastructures that have been built up over the years to both for harnessing the advantages of water and protecting us against its destructive aspects. People who think about water also recognize that water and energy are totally interconnected with one another. Most people are a little surprised to realize that the largest amount of withdrawals for water in the United States, and in fact in most industrialized countries, is not for agriculture. It is for energy, for cooling, mostly cooling thermoelectric power plants. Now, most of that water goes back into the river, hopefully at the right temperature that they took it out in clean form. But we actually face limitations, even in our own country, on the number of power plants that we're able to build just because of the the volumes of water that have to be taken out of the rivers. Freshwater scarcity is the chief reason why 3.5 billion people are expected to live in countries, including India, Pakistan, and possibly China, that will not be able to feed themselves in the next 20 years. We've never had a situation in the world like that. Volatile food prices are extremely worrisome in the heavily food import-dependent Middle East. Currently imports 50% of its food. It's going to be rising to 70% as water availability there per person falls by 50% itself over the next 2 generations. Saudi Arabia has been making news. It finally gave up this rather foolhardy policy of pumping dry its non-replenishable aquifer in the desert to become self-sufficient in wheat, in fact, exporting that wheat, and is now, because the aquifer is just giving out and it won't be there anymore, instead they're leasing cropland in places like Sudan, Ethiopia, Pakistan. Some of these are not the most propitious places, or going to be the most reliable also for water shortage and other reasons. But we are beginning to see around the world countries beginning to look to guarantee their food supplies. Food security, which is one, of course, on the Obama administration's agendas, is taking place, is starting to take place with or without us. It's happening. Throughout history, that's documented in this book, that nations that have been unable to grow or reliably import inexpensive enough food have often destabilized and often sometimes collapsed. Some of those failing states, such as water-famished Yemen and Somalia, have been fertile ground for international terrorist groups. Yemen most recently with the attempted Christmas bombing in Detroit. From the Al-Qaeda group that has taken root in that country. And of course, Somalia has the piracy on the shipping lanes, which is a world problem. The fact that Israel gets 2/3 of its water supply from lands that it had won in the Six-Day War, which itself had been partly triggered by disputes over Jordan River water, or control of Jordan River water, I should say, and that it doles out about a third of that water that it won a third of that water, of its water, comes from the West Bank aquifer that it shares with Palestinians in a 4-to-1 sharing ratio in Israelis' favor, just enough for the Palestinians to have drink, but not do much else with it. Is one of those additional grievances that is underlying the Middle East peace process. The Arabs often accuse the Israelis of stealing their water. There are 1 billion people in this world that lack access to safe drinking water. 2.6 billion don't have basic sanitation. This is more than just a humanitarian tragedy. It also poses contagious health risks that do not stop at borders. And it is a massive problem for economic development. Both are tragically visible inside Haiti, for those of you who looked closely at those stories. I had been myself in Kenya laying some water pipes at some point from a well to about 2 miles of water pipes to a waterless village. The people it alleviated the people from having to walk 2 to 3 hours every day, giving mostly, a lot of them were children giving up their school days, or a lot of their school days, women as well who could no longer do productive work, to fetch water, which is very heavy. I mean, it weighs 8 1/3 pounds per gallon, and you have to have at least, well, they say at least minimum 13 to be healthy, perfect, but they don't have that amount. They might get 4 or 5 gallons if they're lucky for each one of themselves. But you can imagine carrying 200 pounds of water every day for that distance. It's a heartbreaking waste of personal and human capital when you see that, and when you know that it can be solved so easily. There are dislocations from the water shocks, like the floods and the mudslides and the droughts, that are overwhelming existing water infrastructures, have already driven millions of people from rural farms in India, Bangladesh, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, often pouring into cities themselves that don't have enough water and become very combustible. We're expected to have 150 million, what some people call climate change refugees, but I would like to think of them as water refugees because it's water that is driving them, within a decade. As water runs scarce and populations surge, we have this problem of how to keep the peace on the 263 shared river basins and countless shared but invisible groundwater resources that are also diminishing, in trying to come up with positive sums incentives for people to cooperate in these regions, as they have pretty much remarkably up to this point in time. We also have a problem that there are upriver states that in some cases are, in particular, need to be engaged. And 2 of them to keep in mind are Turkey, which is really the Mideast's new water superpower, among other things. The headwaters of both the Tigris and the Euphrates rise in Turkey. It has other water resources as well, but through the Euphrates, it dictates the flows that go down to Syria and Iraq. Iraq, which in the 1960s got the lion's share of the water, today gets about 15% of that, and has several times, Syria and Iraq, most recently in the fall, have gone hand in glove to the Turks to try to allow more water to flow. But that river is dammed up 150% they have projects on the board for 150% of the water. I mean, that's in the Euphrates. Well, obviously that's impossible, and the Turks are making those decisions unilaterally at this point in time. The other country to keep an eye on is China. China controls the Tibetan Plateau. Sometimes almost all of Asia's main rivers rise in that region, and they are, of course, in a breakneck race for economic growth. And they are building dams on those rivers. And in the next 10 or 15, 20 years from now, I think we're going to be hearing similar stories about the Mekong and the Salween running short. Are these countries going to cooperate or not? At the moment, Turkey and China were 2 of 3 countries that voted against the 1997 UN Convention, not yet in effect, that said that upriver states should behave in such a way that they don't harm downriver states. They just don't like it. The third one, by the way, is Burundi on the Nile that has aspirations I think they're not going to be able to achieve. But I will point out, because maybe we can get to it in some of the questions into the detail on Egypt, but Egypt is like Iraq in the 1960s, had this anomalous situation has been in an anomalous situation of being a downriver state that has been able to have the lion's share of the water. That is ahistorical, and now that dams are being built in Ethiopia and Sudan and very poor countries, that they are in negotiations now they hope to preserve what they've got, but their populations are rising very fast too, and that's a very scary situation as well. I'd also just say that corporate leaders in Davos at the World Economic Forum also recently addressed this issue. They raised the concern about these food bubbles, that is, all this groundwater that is being used for producing food in India and Pakistan, in particular, but we're doing it in the United States, in the Central Valley, and North China Plain is also going dry. When they hit bottom, those food bubbles are going to burst, and it's going to be very ugly. They're afraid, however, about another thing, really more than anything else. At least that's how I read the news story, and that is that they're worried that increasingly insufficient quantity and quality of water is going to disrupt transnational corporate supply chains. And it's also going to provoke nationalist and anti-market backlashes that will disrupt this predictable, welcoming environment that they need, the businesses need to operate, and which the world is going to need, frankly, in a free world trading system if we're going to be able to meet the need of that 3.6 billion people that are going to live in countries that can't feed themselves. It's true that I do believe that water scarcity may be rising to prominence in the 21st century, but it is not exactly true that it is becoming more important than oil as much as reasserting, as you said, or what has always been its primacy as the most critical, indispensable resource. I'm going to skip over something here that I would like to maybe in questions get to, because I just want you all to think about just how much water you think you personally consume each day, personally. And we will come back to that question if we get a minute, because I think you're going to be surprised by the answer. And it will underline very clearly the importance of water for almost everything that we do. In every age of history, water, the prosperity of every society has depended on how well it has controlled and harnessed its water resources for productive uses and protected against its destructive aspects. Invariably, the great waterworks, if you think about them, the great waterworks of history have been among the epic challenges of their age, and when their breakthroughs have been made, they've been associated with turning points of civilization and with the rise and also the declines of great states when they fail. Just think of the agricultural revolution at the start of world history. That led with in Egypt, in the Nile, Mesopotamia, the Indus. These folks got control of these rivers for large-scale irrigation, managed to harness the manpower that's required to do that, and began to build civilization. Think of our own age. What's the seminal invention of the Industrial Revolution? It's the steam engine. It's water in another form applied to industry. Rome obviously had its aqueducts that allowed a city to grow to a size of 1 million, which may not seem like a lot of people, but it was an amazing amount of people in those days, because cities were death traps, frankly, because there was not enough clean water to wipe away in sanitation. Think of the canals that had the role in history. The Grand Canal in China, 1,000 miles long, early 7th century. It unified southern and northern China and was the springboard to what became that remarkable age of Chinese civilization in the Middle Ages. We've, in our own era, had the Erie Canal, and we all, I think many of us in this room understand the importance that had in the United States. The Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, and then you fast forward to the thing that really transformed our far west. I mean, our arid far west needed irrigation on a large scale to be able to utilize its resources. And the great breakthrough came with Hoover Dam, the multi-purpose dams that brought irrigation, hydropower, flood control, were immediately replicated around the world in remarkable fashion. There are now 45,000 giant dams around the world, half of them in China, including the largest at Three Gorges. These also was the springboard also for one of the facilitators of the Green Revolution. And that Green Revolution, because the Green Revolution required an intensive amount of water to go along with the fertilizer and the hybridization of the crops. This is what allowed the world population to grow to such an enormous amount without the horrors that we've seen in world history when water resources have been out of line with population levels, and that usually it adjusts by starvation and pretty miserable things. But of course, that brings us full circle because every era, the success of each era brings us to creates the challenges of the next era, and it's that 6.5 billion people rising to 9 with prosperity that is causing, and the way that we use water today that is creating the basic problem today. I won't go into the details of it here because we're running out of time, but I will close on this point that the water crisis is presenting us really with two great challenges. One is a water ecosystem crisis. Many of our vital water ecosystems are now, for the very first time, we need to think about them as requiring water themselves to be able to continue to be sustainable. I mentioned the rivers depleting. I've talked about groundwater depleting. Our wetlands are gone. The glaciers are melting. I mean, without paying attention and figuring out how to manage the ecosystems themselves, we are not going to. We're going to be in a tough spot. We may get through, but it's going to be tough. So there have been really four uses for water in world history, but ecosystem management now is the fifth new critical resource. And the second, this has also got to be managed at the same time that we should think about our world society polarizing increasingly into this water and water have-nots. There really are different types of water have-nots that we can address in the question and answer period. And man has two choices about how to deal with these. The best one is to use our existing water resources in a much more productive manner. But that requires political upheavals that so far few have been willing to undertake. The other is to try to buy time and hope for some kind of a technology or other kind of organizational innovation to come around that will bail us out. The greatest hopes are desalination, genetically modified food that uses more crop for less drops, and recycling. In the meantime, what are we doing? Well, we're overpumping that groundwater as it goes down to the bottom. And some places, like in China, they're building massive canals, aqueducts, like the big versions of what we got in California, that take water from where we think we have more of it, and we move it to where that we know that they're short. So China has got the south to north water diversion projects going, which are probably the largest water projects on Earth at the current time. But in the end, those are really, they don't solve the problem because even in those other regions, they run out as well. So on that note, I'll open it up to questions, and thank you very much.
I thank you very much for taking us through the ebb and flow of water issues. It was really a terrific talk. So I'd like to open the floor for questions. I just ask that you wait until the microphone comes to you, and please identify yourself. Susan?
Susan Gittleson. It's not by accident that your name is Solomon. You have undertaken a major issue, and we thank you for it. And I was waiting for what came up only in your last sentence, which is, what can we do about it, especially in our technology-focused age, when there are technologies such as desalinization that could be used so much more widely. So would you be a little optimistic for us and go into some of the solutions?
All right. Well, I was going to conclude with why the future may not look like the past. We have avoided wars, so that's optimistic for the most part on those. But on the desal question, or on some of the other technologies, look, desal is a great technology that's coming into its own. Its costs have come down dramatically. There's great progress being made on the reverse osmosis process, the filtration, the filters and such. It still has limitations. It still is a fossil fuel powered technology that, okay, I mean, when you're short of water, you don't care, but it does have a trade-off with climate change and other problems. When the water comes on shore, it still has to be pumped. And pumping water is a very energy-intensive operation, and it's got to be moved somewhere. So you really are only going to, so it's only being used really where in the most critical of situations at the current time. But the good side, the good news is, I mean, Israel is one of the most progressive countries actually when it comes to water use, as is Australia. I will add, and they are building 5 big desal plants that will be able to produce about 50%. Will add 50% to their water supply in the next by 2020. It's projected to. It will produce more water than they're taking out of the West Bank aquifer. So if the world decides they wish to trade that water for peace with the Palestinians on that's a deal I think that we can do. So that's there. There's been progress on genetically modified crops as well. But the problem is that the timing of this. I mean, even if you had the big breakthroughs in desal tomorrow, the build out from such a tiny base would be probably pretty long. There's a lot of money I can tell you, there's a lot of money on the sidelines waiting to rush in. That's not going to be the problem. But the organizational problems, the things that are keeping these billion people without, why do a billion people not have safe drinking water in the world today? It's not a technical problem, it's an organizational problem. Those aren't going to vanish with a breakthrough in desal. So I have my doubts that the timing is going to work out well, that you're going to be able to build out fast enough whatever breakthroughs might come down the pike to be able to meet the needs as water begins to run short in some of these critical places.
Yes.
Thank you. Jane Kaczynski from the British Consulate General in New York. You mentioned that Israel and Australia have relatively progressive policies on water management. And I'm wondering if you could give us a snapshot of some of the policies there that would be translatable to the U.S., given that
Sure.
we have so many regional differences here.
We do indeed. Well, let me just take what Australia has done, which is a fairly remarkable thing. They had the Murray-Darling Basin is one of the most arid areas and has faced an extreme drought for a long period of time. It was actually, as I understand it, somewhat analogous to the way that water grew up, similar to the western portion of the United States, actually. So it's a good analogy. The government actually moved very aggressively, tore up the old water rights rules, and created from the ground up a system where the government itself would purchase enough water for the ecosystem, and the rest of it became open for bidding. And they today have a trading system, a functioning market trading system, where you can buy water rights for the available amounts of water that are in that river. And this is done over mobile telephone. It took them a long time to get all the kinks out of it, but they went through, in the last 10 years or so, a situation where they lost something like 70% of the water that they had previously. That's remarkable. They did not lose any. They're still producing the same amount of food that they did before. It's different food. They're not exporting rice, unfortunately, to Malaysia or wherever else or Singapore. But they came through that very efficiently. It's sophisticated. They've got, because of the irrigation, that puts salts back in the water. You can also trade for if people are planting trees that take some of the salt out of the ground, they trade the rights because you got to pay for the pollution as well. Israel, on the other hand, has been doing several things. It now treats about 70% of its wastewater is now not treated up to potable levels, but is kept as gray water, and then is then shipped down to the farms, as used because you can use that kind of water for agriculture. They have basically a dual piping system in the country, which is very efficient. They pioneered the drip irrigation techniques long ago. They've also been very interestingly moving to, just like Australia, to trying to improve the productivity of their farming by actually raising the cost of water to the farmers, which is the thing that we will not do, in this country today, and in most places will not do. And they are beginning to phase out some of their agriculture and realize they have to rely on the trading system. They just can't have self-sufficiency in food. They recognize that, and they are an industrialized society, so they have other means to earn the revenues to pay for those imports. So those are a few of the the things that they've done. But for the United States, which I got to tell you, we are sitting on an economic resource in this country that we don't even recognize. It is, we are a water-wealthy country. We don't have the population problems that a lot of other parts of the world do. We have an industrial base that's very potent. We have institutional order that allows us, if we put our mind to it, to increase the productivity of our own water use very much more dramatically than has happened through the pollution regulations. That's the way we've done it so far. And we could become and should become, both for our own economic advantage, also to help be able to provide the food, the industrial goods, and other energy-intensive, water-intensive energy products that the world is going to need desperately in the next number of 20 years. As a matter of foreign policy, we'd increase our leverage in the world if we were able to provide that stability to many of these countries. But we are just not even thinking about it. It's not even on most people's radar.
Yes?
My name is Palan Kadgara, and my company is Watermaker India. What we do is essentially tap the atmospheric water, and we are manufacturers of atmospheric water generators. I'm proud to announce that we have just celebrated our 1 year of giving Jalimudi village in South India fresh drinking water from the atmosphere. We hope this technology will get some wings. We're working with the governments in India and Malaysia and some other countries to tap atmospheric water and give villages water. We're not depleting groundwater resources. Our water is pure, does not need purification. Thank you.
Well, that's one of the technologies there. I'm not enough familiar with the question. The one question I would just ask is what are the limits of how much you can take out of the atmosphere, but without also affecting the water cycle itself. But
the limitations of the technology essentially are temperature and humidity. It works in hot, humid weather, and we need power from any source.
Right.
So we're working with geothermal, with solar. It's expensive technology right now, but like solar power, which is still expensive, and I don't think there's a solar company around that's still making profit. We hope to get there.
Okay, cool. Good luck.
David?
I'm David Hunt. About 10 years ago or more, I read about a very imaginative project which involved towing an iceberg from Antarctica to Saudi Arabia. And I
Melted along the way.
I actually met 2 summers ago a Texan who had a camp up in Canada who was involved in this project, but I didn't have a chance to ask him why it wasn't repeated and sort of what the economics were. So if you could comment on that, please. And the second question is, where is the most effective research into desalinization occurring in the world?
Okay. Well, the answer to the first question is the honest answer is I don't really know the true answer, but I do know that all those projects have been abandoned. I mean, they were going to drag bags. They had Medusa bags that were going to carry plastic bags, and we're going to float those down, and it none of them really panned out. And the fact there was a Texan involved doesn't surprise me because they've been thinking about these big, massive water-moving schemes across the United States for decades to try to get water down into Texas. The second question, the second one is that there's a lot going on. I mean, Orange County, California, Southern California has launched some big projects. I mentioned Israel. Cyprus has got something. Singapore has got some very state-of-the-art desal plants. There are a lot of big companies are working in this area. There was a great consolidation actually took place where I think the 3Ms and the GEs and all the others were buying up all the little small creative companies, and they're working very much on the membrane technology is really where a lot of the action is there. So there's a lot of people working on it. It's not going to fail because people are ignoring it.
Rod?
Roswell Perkins, a retired lawyer. The figure you gave of shooting for 50% of Israel's water supply from desalinization, I think is fascinating. Can you tell us what power they're using to do that? And as a supplement to that, have there been any thought of having nuclear plants associated with desalinization plants. But what is Israel using for
As
the
a fuel.
power source? Is it oil or?
It's well, it is fossil fuel. I'm not sure if it's gas. I think it's a gas form, but I'm not 100% sure on it. I'd have to research that and get back to you on that. As for nuclear, again, not sure of the answer. I think certainly people have thought about it, but nuclear has, not been exactly the most popular technology in some parts of the world recently. So I'm not sure that they are. I've not heard that really too much before, in the regard to desal.
Lindsay?
Lansing Lamont. I was curious about your remark that the U.S. is such a water-wealthy nation. Everything I read talks about our aquifers depleting, the Alagala out in the Middle West, terrible droughts and parched Southwest perennially, the great waste of water which this country is embarked on. And I wonder what your prediction is
Okay.
over the next few decades.
Okay. Well, we have approximately of accessible, reliable water, something on the order of, let me get this right here. We got 8% of the world's water, and we have only 4% of the population. Okay, so we're, 5 times more per capita than China, for example. Okay, and more than that for India, which is I think maybe 7-to-1 ratio. The fact that we do in fact waste a lot of the water, as you yourself mentioned, is part of our problem. We also, of course, there's some of it is also polluted as well. The usage questions, there's leakage. Pipes leak. We know that. The problem here is that we've never put an economic value really on the water itself. Even the delivery of the water and all the. Think about what goes into it. You got to collect the water. You got to pre-filter it. All the send it down in the pipes, and it takes energy. And then you got to treat the wastewater before it goes out. It's a big involved process, and we do not. We've never, and almost nobody in the world actually charges a sufficient amount even to keep up the pipes, much less for the actual cost of the water. On top of that, we use it for, look, most of it goes to agriculture that is very uneconomically productive, relatively speaking, but you got to eat. So some subsidies are inevitable in this process, but you really want it to go to encourage the agriculture that's going to use it in a much more efficient manner. I'll give you one statistic, just this one thing. In the United States, between 1900 and 1975, our water use grew 3 times faster than population. This was normal historic trend. Today, as I say, in the world, the situation is twice as fast as world population. But from 1975 to the current day, actually our water use in this country has not only plateaued, it's actually declined a little bit. Our population has gone up 30% in the meantime, and our GDP has not suffered either. There's been an enormous increase in water productivity. Why did that happen? The thing that happened that stands out is that that's associated with the period that we put in the Clean Water Act. And suddenly there was a cost an effective cost put on the water use for those to whom it applied. And it did not apply to agribusinesses for the most part. It applies to thermoelectric plants, to industry, to what we call point sources, and to some cities. Well, those being markets responded the way businesses are going to respond. They said, if we're going to have to put back this water into the environment in the same way we took it out, we're going to try to figure out technologies to use less of it, to find better technologies to use it so that we don't have to, it's not so costly. So there's been a great productivity increase in this country, but we could go, let's say there's a 30% increase, you could probably easily double, go 100%. But if you could figure out to make these rules put on the agribusinesses, the cities themselves are expected, even in California, in the new bill that they're working on out there, to increase by 20 to 30% just in the cities, which have already done a lot through recycling technologies, which is actually one of the better technologies I should have answered before to your question. The recycling of water. In other words, the wastewater that we produce is actually very clean. In fact, I think the astronauts actually drink purified wastewater themselves. We can drink it. In fact, in Windhoek, in Africa, they actually do. But in most places, they put it back into the ground and then pull it out again, just because it seems doesn't the toilet to tap doesn't seem so appealing. But it works, And there's and again, the same membrane technologies we're talking about before in desal are also being applied in making progress in this area. So there's an awful lot that can be done, but you've got to start by getting the market engaged in the process of using water efficiently, and also within a framework that then says that maintaining the ecosystem has a cost. So I mean, I've been going around trying to say, well, what we really need to do is two things. I mean, you need to you got to deregulate some of the more egregious politically subsidized uses of water, both on the supply side and on the pollution side. And at the same time, you put in a golden rule that says everybody has to return water to the environment in the same clean condition you took it out in. So the next guy has the same fair use of it that you did. I mean, sort of fair play. I mean, obviously this is really hard to get to, and it's a lot of complications and all of that. But as a general principle, it would engage market forces on the side of a clean environment and more using water efficiently. It would be great.
Robert?
Robert Shaw, do you know of any examples of multilateral or bilateral treaties covering the right of one state to divert waters or overuse waters upriver?
Oh, yes.
Or any decisions of international tribunals that set forth principles on this?
Tribunals, I'm not sure. There's been a great work done on this. I mean, look, there's been much more, well, for all the predictions of water wars and all of that, there's been far more cooperation around the world, and there are many rivers that have basin agreements amongst them on water sharing. The thing that makes it work, the Mekong has had one without China for a long time. As I say, we're expecting one on the Nile, where I won't go into the history there, but that's be a breakthrough. There are dozens of those. And the thing that makes them work is that when you cooperate on a river, it should be a positive sum game. You should be able to get more resources out of the river than each person sort of going on their own and just grabbing what they can. And that happens because where do you put storage? For example, we have Aswan Dam, is stored in a terrible place. I mean, they lose 12% of the water in the river just because of evaporation, And when the British controlled the whole region, they were going to put it up in the highlands where there was much less evaporation. Sometimes you want to clean up swamps that maybe also divert water and resources. So by cooperating, we've not only averted, not only that, people who work in this field say that water, rather than becoming a source of conflict, actually becomes one of those things that somewhat of rivals find themselves able to agree upon and then expand into other areas of agreement, finding common grounds and negotiations between them. I don't think it's yet reached the level of law at an international level. I've spoken an awful lot to the World Bank. People have done a lot of work in negotiating these agreements and are active on the Nile. That's available on the web. It's not hard to find that research on that.
Elaine?
Hi, I'm Alain Olivier. I'm with the Quebec Government Office in New York. A great point on the cooperation that you just mentioned. For example, regarding the Great Lakes, there's a great project between 8 U.S. states, 2 Canadian provinces to make an effort to prevent diversions and to manage water quality. But I'd have a question on the market mechanisms point you brought up earlier. As opposed to other commodities like soybeans or orange juice or corn, water is essential for human sustenance. So it's really, in economic terms, it's the ultimate public good.
Right.
So does it make any sense to make a commodity out of water, to privatize it, in other words?
Well, that's not necessarily privatizing it. The government still owns it in most cases. But the way to go forward is this. I think the most enlightened way to think about it, and that's a good point you're making, is what some people call the 3 E's. It should be 3 things at once: an economic good, if you will, used efficiently, water for the ecosystems itself, okay, and equity, social equity. The way that you make this work in practice, I think, if you could negotiate good contracts, is that you should have tiered pricing. I mean, look, there are 13 gallons. That is tiered pricing, meaning that for the lowest amount of usage, let's say the 13 gallons that people believe is the minimum that we all need to have a good quality of life. It could be free. I mean, it could even be free, or $1. I mean, it's something everybody could afford. As the volumes move up in terms of usage, the price goes up to encourage efficiencies rather than encouraging waste. For example, today in California, we're working on grandfathered water rights that go to farmers or not farmers, agribusinesses who got the water when the original irrigation systems were put in. They have they call it a use it or lose it kind of law out there, where if they don't use all their water that was allocated to them, or their grandparents or great grandparents, they lose the right to it and it goes down to somebody else. So they just flood their fields regardless. I mean, it's not inefficient use of that water, and they flood it away. The guys who come right after them in water rights, who sometimes get the water and sometimes don't get the water, are very efficient users of the water because they sometimes don't get enough. So they have the ones who put it. They're the ones who are leading the cause. But the logic is crazy. I mean, it's inverted, right? So the answer to the question is you've got to protect the basic human right. I mean, I do think if there is a human right to anything of physical good, it should be water. And 13 gallons would not strain anybody's reservoirs. That's not hard. Even more than that. I mean, in Europe, I think they use 50 to 60 per household, or maybe a little more. We use 150. I mean, we don't even need that much. But we could pay more if you want to use 150. But let us pay a little more. But then when you get to the big volume users, the price goes up. The problem has been where this has occurred in other countries where there's been problems, like in Bolivia and elsewhere, is that either the contracts were made badly and the prices went up for poor people beyond what they could afford, or the governments were inept or corrupt, and the businesses, frankly, were very short-sighted because they all led to political backlashes that got them kicked out of the countries anyway. So. It's organization.
Last question, Shazia.
Shazia Rafi with Parliamentarians for Global Action. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the last question on, these agreements that have been made, as you said, more on a cooperative basis. And they seem to be flowing through with economic channels of the World Bank or regional institutions. At the same time, with 263 of these shared basins, there seems to be an opportunity for some level of preventive diplomacy looking forward in terms of foreign policy. So do you think, given your research and what you know of these agreements that have worked, is it better that it is really channeled through the economic organizations and in a sense as economic policy rather than going down the channels of the international political UN convention route? Because we've done a little bit of work with parliamentarians in South Asia on water management and then also in the Caucasus and the Aegean. And those succeeded because it was focused on the economic shared good concept rather than, looking at it in terms of politics and diplomacy. So I just wonder where you think this is headed, or it should head.
Okay, it's a big question, and it's not one that I, researched very thoroughly. So I'm going to take my answer for what it's worth. I mean, it's just an opinion. I think ultimately, countries tend, and I do, and I did, you did mention I did another book on, and I'll be influenced by that too, on an international economic policy making in the area of finance. Saw how the world worked a little bit in those areas. Look, I guess I have a bit of a cynical view. I do think that countries ultimately act, what they generally perceive to be their best interests. So sometimes passions overrule their best interests, but the economic, you do want to find something where everybody sees that there's something in it for them economically. Whether that comes through, the best is if you can do it if you can do it locally and regionally, that's the best, obviously, because that you know all the details, and every water situation is different. There's no cookie cutter for any of these problems. If you do it through World Bank mediation, World Bank used to control the financial strings. That was its lever. They've lost that lever today. China is financing dams, 220 dams approximately around the world right now, including the ones in Ethiopia and Sudan that the World Bank would not have financed earlier because Egypt would have objected to it. So, and would not have done these 3 E's. There's a bit of becoming an unruly aspect to this. On the other side, that's good, because sometimes the World Bank and some of the international institutions are very stultifying institutions. Brazil has been sort of going on its own, has done great things actually in terms that, but outside of the what were considered sort of the best practices of the day by the multilaterals. So the answer is, that's sort of a jumbled answer, but I just think everybody has got to the different levels have to start working on it. The State Department for the first time is engaged, okay? The U.S. State Department, Harvard has the former head of the World Bank up there, and they're focusing on a number of these countries as well. And they are bringing together some resources that can solve work on some of the technical problems. There are very deep social problems in each one of these water issues. Equity issues are very profound when they build a dam, for example. People are moved out, and those issues, it upsets the social structures and if in societies. And if you upset the local community social structures, these projects don't work. So it is a whole level of complication. I think the more people that are focusing on it and aware of it, bringing attention to it, gives you a higher chance of success.
Well, I thank you very much, but before we conclude, you just have to tell us how many gallons of water do we consume every day?
Okay, that's right. Thank you for reminding me.
Thank you.
All right. Well, the answer. Does anybody want to volunteer an answer to that question?
How many gallons of water do we consume each day?
How much water do you think you consume in a given day, personally? How much? 45 gallons, you think?
When you say consume, do you mean drink or like
No, not washing dishes. No, not washing dishes, but take into your body. All right, I'm going to give you. I actually want to find the page I have written all it out, but it's 1,000. It's 1,000 gallons. Because you're forgetting the food you eat and all the water that went into the food you eat, and if you eat a hamburger, by itself, it's 700 or 800 gallons. So if you're a meat eater, it's a big number. The shirt on your back, a T-shirt, 700 gallons for a T-shirt. Little computer chip. That's 2,000 gallons of ultra-purified water to make that tiny little chip. And there are industries are huge users of water. So you realize that when you begin to think of it, water is really a big deal in everything that we do.
All right. Well, on that note, I thank you very much for joining us, and I'd like to invite the rest of you to continue the conversation.